Hey friends, I have a hopefully interesting topic for you to consider today. I was thinking earlier, I make these videos in many ways for like me 15 years ago, trying to sort of work through this stuff. But it's something that I think might be useful, and it came out of something I said in a video last week, I think, or the week before, maybe even earlier. So here's a theory I want to just present and place in front of you and allow you to marinate with and experience, and I think it can help with readings. And here's my thesis, here's my theory. All of the cards, the trumps included, idle and neutral. The cards themselves are neutral. And it's in the context of the question and the other cards where they go forward or reverse, so to speak. And in this analogy, clumsily I suppose, we could call forward its light aspect and reverse its shadow aspect, for example, or its positive and its negative. But the cards themselves, in essence, don't have any particular bent. They don't go in any particular direction necessarily. They don't act in any particular way, good or bad. They just are. And it's in context that they find their meaning, or that their meaning comes into its own. And that can be something that is hard to see because the art on the cards does something different. The art on the cards, and here's something very controversial, and I don't mean it as a negative to the artists of the many, many decks I own and love, but every time an artist draws one of these concepts, they're making a value judgment about it. Now, here's one of the most extreme examples of that. So here is number 4. This is what would be the Emperor card in many decks. This is the War card from one of my favorite decks, the Japaridza Tarot. So this is a really interesting example. So the archetype of the Emperor here is depicted as a transition into war. So what the artist is doing in this case is they're making a value judgment about power, about patriarchy, about temporal rulership, etc. I may agree with all of the things that this artist is saying about kings and leadership and the violence of men in history. But the depiction on this card is a value judgment about the archetype of the Emperor. And that makes it not neutral. You know what I mean? Like, war is not neutral. War is destructive, no matter how you paint it. Emperor is neutral. So the reason I'm using this as an example is just sort of takes what I'm about to sort of talk about and puts it in hopefully a clearer spotlight, which is that the art choices that an artist makes on the card is a value judgment on the archetype of the card. They're saying something about the archetype that the trump represents, that the major arcana represent. And all decks do this to various or lesser or more degrees. And one of the decks that has done this the most is the Wade Smith deck. And again, this is not a value judgment on the artists, but it's very clear that Wade had an agenda. He was coming from the Golden Dawn. The Golden Dawn had very specific, very, very detailed associations for all the trumps that were based on French mysticism leading up to it, but that prior to Atea and all of the French esotericists who sort of draped the tarot with this stuff, those associations didn't necessarily exist. The archetypes just were. So let's just sort of look at that in action. So I've got 2 decks here, and I actually chose this one deliberately because this is a Marseille style deck. And I don't think I have another. I should have thought about this earlier. Do I have another Marseille deck that's in order? I don't think I do. It doesn't matter. If you've seen any Marseille deck, all of the art is neutral for the most part. The artist, the woodblock carver, whoever, does not have an agenda, I would argue, other than making money. You know, they were an artist for hire making money on a deck of playing cards. This version of the Marseille deck is making a value judgment on those archetypes, but it's doing it as a consistent thing all the way through, and it's just depicting those archetypes in sort of a creepy Tim Burton-esque way. But as we go through, what we'll be able to do is compare it to other archetypes, and we'll see that there is a neutrality. Now, again, this isn't saying that the Waite-Smith method is good or bad. What I'm saying is that the Waite deck and the artwork that he and Pamela Coleman-Smith created together, because he was very actively involved in the majors, made a value judgment on each card based on associations. But prior to those associations, the cards just were, and they just represented a thing. So if we examine the Fool card together, you know, the Fool, even in this deck, is neutral in the sense of it represents a thing that we are familiar with, which is a wanderer, a hobo, you know, a madman even, but an archetype that is what it is. Now, the Fool in the Waite deck is very different. The Fool in the Waite deck is making a choice. And the posture of this card is got a freeness about it. There's a beauty, there's a, you know, this is one of my favorite cards in any deck. Love it. But it's saying something. That this is just depicting a camp stereotype. You know, the hobo, the madman, the village idiot. This is depicting an ecstatic experience of liberation, right? There's a value judgment. In fact, even if we go to the way Waite writes about this card, he says, with a light step, as if the earth and its trammels had little power to restrain him, a young man in gorgeous vestments pauses at the brink of a precipice among the great heights of the world. He surveys the blue distance before him, its expanse of sky rather than the prospect below. His act of eager walking is still indicated, though he is stationary at the given moment. His dog is still bounding. The edge which opens on the depth has no terror. Do you see what I mean? Like, he is describing an experience that's a value judgment on the archetype of the Fool, or the madman, or the wanderer. So, and this is true throughout the deck. You know, as we get to the magician, again, this is one of the most major examples. You know, we have the battleur, or the juggler, who, again, is just a stock character. He is the trickster, or the entertainer, the performer. The magician, on the other hand, is a value judgment on that archetype. The magician, in this case, is a ceremonial magician. The archetype of the female pope, the stereotype, the stock character, becomes the high priestess. There's a value judgment on that. The empress here, with its astrological associations, with all the intentional symbolism that's in the card, this is one of my favorite cards too, is different than the temporal ruler or the consort that's depicted in the older images. The emperor, very similar in intent, but again, filled with associations of Aries and the ram and the river, all things that I would argue were not necessarily intentional. And as you continue to go through the deck, there are a lot of examples where the artists, and this is true of any deck I think inspired by or reacting to or in conversation with the Rider-Waite-Smith deck. You know, so here we have Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden as the lovers. It's a very different archetype in older decks. This is said to depict a mythological moment, but again, it's the archetype of leaving home, of moving from, you know, home to manhood, so to speak, again. And the interesting thing in French is that that's the lover, it's not necessarily the lovers. But we have a value judgment on that in the art. So the reason that I'm talking about this and sort of belaboring this point as we go through is that every deck you look at that's, again, in serving in relationship to, in conversation with, or a reaction to the Rider-Waite-Smith deck is making a judgment on each of the trumps. And sometimes they're using the same judgments that Waite-Smith did. Sometimes they're reacting to it. So you'll see modern decks that have a pagan influences that are reacting to the overtly Christian imagery of the Golden Dawn. But every card that we look at is depicting an archetype that in itself is neutral. It doesn't really have any value one way or the other, but the image will tell us something that's a judgment on the card. The Hanged Man is another good example. And the reason the Hanged Man is another good example is that in older decks this would have been called the Traitor or the Hanged One, etc. And it's just a dude hanging in punishment. But the transcendental, the transcendent experience that the Golden Dawn applied to this card takes that archetype and makes a judgment on it and says it's something. And the reason that this is important is because it affects our interpretation of the cards in a reading, and we are reacting often not just to the archetype but to the art. The Tower, again, is an interesting example, and I'm comparing the sort of Marseille style with the Rider-Waite-Smith, and sort of using the Rider-Waite-Smith to talk about how every card is a value judgment. You know, it's fair to say that every card in a Marseille style deck is a value judgment too. It's the artist's interpretation of an archetype. But the art in Marseille style decks is more neutral, I guess is where I'm going. And again, that's not a good or bad thing. It's not a judgment on the deck. This is just part of the conversation about how the art in a deck is saying something about the archetype it's representing. So the Tower is an archetype of change. It's an archetype of destruction, etc., of shake-up of drama. The older images have far less symbology. It's got a tower being hit by something. This has Hebrew letters in it. It's got a lot of storm and drama to it that's very different from what's here. But both of these are value judgments on the archetype represented by the Tower. Change, dramatic sudden change, right? We react to the art because it's what we see, and art creates a really visceral connection to us. And so, whether or not we believe it, a lot of the time, our interpretations of the cards are really peppered by the art more than the archetype. And that makes it harder to see the Tower as anything other than a bad thing. You know, anyone who's grown up with any connection to Western civilization knows that the devil is bad. But the art is telling us that. You know, if the art said the devil was something beautiful, we'd be reacting to that in the reading. So, where I'm going in this very lengthy discussion is that what we can do as readers is to start from 1, to start from 0, as it were, and neutralize it, and sort of step back from the image and consider the archetype. And from there, we can allow the images to tell us, or we can allow the archetype to tell us things that the image may be covering up. Now, this isn't to say the images aren't important. They are, and they're going to tell us a lot. But when it comes to the trumps in particular, the message that I'm trying to send is that they're not good or bad. The Tower always looks bad, and when it comes up in a reading, even if we accept that the cards are all neutral, when we see that image, it doesn't relax us, you know. But the archetype underneath it is neutral. It's the context that provides it. So where I'm getting at, you know, as I ramble here, is each card in itself is an idea separate from the picture that's depicting it. I had a math teacher once who said to us this, you know, and I've never been good at math, but he was talking about the difference between numbers and numerals. A numeral, the thing we read on a piece of paper, the numeral 5 that we type or write on a piece of paper, isn't the number. It's the idea of the number. He was saying it's the idea of fiveness. It describes the quality of 5. But the numeral isn't the number. It's what represents the number. In essence, it's a piece of art that depicts the idea of fiveness, of 5. And it's the same thing with the trumps. These pictures are representations of fullness. These are representations of magicianness. But because artists have a point of view, especially if they're esoteric artists, their representation of the idea colors the way we see the idea. But the idea still remains. And so, can you tell how hard this is to talk about? But hopefully you're staying with me. So what I'm saying ultimately, to sort of sum up, is that the value judgment that we feel when we see the picture of the magician is a card in this deck I've always loved. This is a really empowering image to me. I remember reading in one of Rachel Pollack's books years ago that it's the act of channeling what's above from below, that posture. And to me, this card and this image in particular has come to represent the act of the creative process. When, for example, I'm a writer, when I'm sitting at my desk and I'm writing and I am not thinking about it and the words are just happening, the story's being told, and I'm just the conduit for it. I don't know where the energy's flowing from, but I know it's flowing into me and onto the page. That's the energy of the magician. But that's a value judgment I've associated with the magician based on this image. The magician can also be a deceiver. The magician, even as posed here, can be the charlatan, the fortune teller who says they can remove a curse. You know, that's part of the magician too. The magician itself is neutral, though when I see this image, I just feel so in love with the act of creation, and I feel like the image itself embodies it. I have to separate myself from that when I'm reading sometimes, because that interpretation is not necessarily key, or it's not necessarily appropriate. If the question were, is my partner cheating on me, this might have a pretty strong indication that the partner is not cheating on them, because the direction of energy is in one way. You know, the magician's focus is on one act. So I would say in this case that they're faithful. If the question is, why is my partner cheating on me? Then in this, and I get the magician, then the answer is different. The presumption of cheating is already there. In this case, the magician is a deceiver. He's a liar. He's a charlatan. He was never faithful. He was never committed. You know what I mean? So the image that the feeling that the image brings to me has nothing to do with the answer to the question. It's the archetype of the magician that I'm really working with. You know what I mean? It's the magicianness, not the image. So let's talk about the tower as another example, just as a more sort of specific and maybe a little less muddy than the one I just used. All right, so here we have the tower. What's going to happen in my relationship? Probably in this case, a negative connotation, right? But it depends on the context of the relationship. Is the relationship happy? If so, this would be probably a negative answer. Is the relationship unhappy? Then this might be a moment of freedom. You know? Am I going to get my electricity back on today? If I'm asking a question about my power being restored, this is the card I want to see, because it's full of electricity. You know what I mean? And it probably would come on really suddenly. But the dramatic image makes me go, oh God, no, your house is going to burn down. No, is my electricity going to come back on today? Yeah, this card is electric. You know what I mean? So the image isn't telling us everything. The image can color the conversation. You know, is my power going to come back on today? Yeah, and you're going to be overwhelmed by all the email you suddenly have to respond to. Yeah, and suddenly you're going to have people over for dinner, and you're going to have to, you know, because no one else has power. Whatever, you know what I mean? Like, you're actually going to go back to the stressed life you had, and you should have enjoyed the whatever, you know what I mean? Like, I can let the image become part of the conversation at that point. But the archetype is the thing that matters. The image is an interpretation of that archetype, and it's a value judgment on it. Sorry, I have so many. I'm having a very tower moment right now because I have so many thoughts going through my head that I'm trying to channel. And that's another thing too. You know, what's my workday going to be like? This doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to get fired. It might mean that there's so much shit to do. I'm not going to be able to get it done. You know, it's just going to be an electric day. That's the archetype. The image is a interpretation of it that's saying something about the artist's feelings of it. Most of the time today, any deck that's influenced by Rider-Waite-Smith is saying something about Waite and Smith's feelings about the archetype. So most decks today are in conversation with the Waite-Smith deck, or with the Thoth deck, or even with the Marseille. This deck is an interpretation of the archetypes in the Marseille deck. They are value judgments on the deck. The reason that I chose this one, is that it's a consistent value judgment. Each card isn't a value judgment, the whole deck is a value judgment on Marseille, and that the world is creepy, for example. And I wish the book is in French, so I can't really talk about it. So, it's a very complicated thing I'm trying to get to, but the thing I'm trying to really underline is that no card, no trump is good or bad, even if the image on it is bad or good. And so as a reader, what is helpful for me to do is to go through the trumps, and really I think this applies to any deck with pictures on it, but to go through the trumps in particular and spend some time engaging the neutral value of the archetype. And this is one area where I think that having an older deck like a Marseille, like a Visconti Sforza, something that's similar, that, you know, the Marseille may be the best bet, or you know, later decks that are Italian but that are pre-Golden Dawn, to compare with your Waite-Smith moment, because you can just sort of see what things looked like before esotericism was draped on it, and it can help us just sort of go back to zero, go back to the beginning, and sort of say, what's the neutral archetype of this card? You know, and it doesn't, I don't think there's a right answer, you know what I mean? What you sort of want to do is use what you know about the card and try to sort of engage your own value judgment as well. So if I say that the Fool is about freedom, freedom is a loaded word. It's not a neutral word. And here's where I have to do some work. Freedom implies escape from restraint or a lack of restraint. So it also has loaded connections to history, to bondage, you know, the slavery kind, not the sexual kind. So what is the neutral archetype? And even as I'm talking about this, I'm saying I'm recognizing in the words that I'm searching for the implied value judgments that I've come up with. I'm reaching for the word sort of nothingness, which it's not super neutral, but nothingness has a slightly negative connotation, but it doesn't necessarily have to. So you know, I don't even think there's a word in English that I can reach for, but I understand the concept of lack of connection, lack of expectation, just sort of, the Fool itself is neutral. So neutrality, neutral, you know what I mean? So then I said, okay, the Fool is the essence of neutralness, of nothingness, of nothing before and nothing after. In context, then that can become something. The juggler or the magician, for example, and this is, I'm going through work that would really involve sort of sitting down and like writing words until I sort of distill it into the one that really is most neutral. But I think one thing that I have found helpful as I've been working through this is to think in terms of verbs. So what does the magician do? The magician performs, for example. Perform is neutral. The magician channels. Channels is neutral. The high priestess or the popess keeps. Now, it's tempting to say she keeps secrets or she holds mysteries, but that suggests withholding. The High Priestess can be withholding, but there are times where withholding is important because we can't reveal secrets. So she keeps. You know what I mean? So you go through and you start to have a conversation with the card, with the idea of the archetype rather than the image, and explore what its level is, what its zero is, what its neutrality is. And when you come up with this card in a reading, you have something to work with, so that if this High Priestess comes up in the context of a question, what's wrong with my relationship, someone's withholding or someone's keeping secrets. On the other hand, how do I improve my relationship? It becomes, you don't have to tell everyone everything. A little mystery can be helpful. Do you see what I mean? But I start with the idea of keeping, of holding. And it doesn't need to encompass everything about the card, because I still know all this other stuff about the card. But it's like a neutral starting point of keeping, of withholding or holding. And then, based on the context of the question, I can work through it. What does the Empress do? The Empress creates. The Empress nurtures. The Empress mothers. Whatever the choice is. And so the question is, how do I get this project off the ground? I need to nurture it. I need to care for it. I need to mother it and fertilize it and, you know, give it my attention and care. Why isn't this project getting off the ground? You're being too smothering, you're being too mothering, you're being, you know, whatever. And all of these sort of imply stereotypes, right? But do you see where we're going? We're starting from a level of no judgment. And maybe that's a better word than neutral. We start with an interpretation or a baseline for the card that does not have judgment, good or bad, but that frees us up so that when the question comes along, we're able to talk about it. So that when the Emperor comes up, it's not necessarily a value judgment on patriarchy, which it can be, but that it's the idea of stability, or the idea of masculinity, or the idea of strength, or rulers, you know, rulership. The Emperor rules. So what do I need to do to get this promotion? I need to be strong and show my skill and authority. Why didn't I get this promotion? Because you came off as too belligerent in the interview. Do you see where I'm going? So that's really the point. And when we start with a base level that's neutral, it allows us to not sweat as much when the card comes up, because we're not necessarily trapped by the image or our bias as triggered by the image. We're inspired by the archetype, and we can go either way. This is another reason why combinations of cards to me are really helpful, because it provides even more context. So let's just do like a quick sample. Let me get this guy out of the way. So this is just the majors of this deck right now. We'll just work with that, because that's sort of where I'm focusing my attention. I think this is true of the minors too. It's actually a little bit harder to do with the minors in the Waite-Smith deck, because that is, like, to me, the quintessence of value judgments on the cards. And it's one reason why I do like reading pit decks, or decks like the Japaridza, where the images are sometimes right at Waite-Smith, but sometimes they're just really kind of different or hard, you know, abstracted in some way. So I'm just shuffling, and I'm just gonna do like a 3-card pull to show how cards in context also affect each other, which is something I talk about a lot. But let's say we're going to ask a question. We have a client who's saying, my relationship with my boss really stinks. Why? So I'm just going to pull 3 cards. I'll talk about them in just a quick neutral way, and then we'll use that to decide whether we're in light or shadow for each card and how that answers the question. So I just want to make sure we have enough shuffle here that we don't get cards in order, but I guess it doesn't really matter. So she wants to know why her relationship with her boss sucks. Alright, so let's just talk first about the neutral sort of baseline for each, right? Strength is, in essence, strength is very literal. There are a couple cards, justice, strength, etc., that are sort of what they are. So there's strength. There's power there. The moon You know, the moon to me is a card that I have struggled with for many years. But I've settled on a fairly negative keyword for it, which is deception. And so I need to find a more neutral word for that, right? Which is the moon misdirects. Or misdirects is good, right? Because it doesn't it's a little bit more neutral than misleads or misunderstand, and the way that I come up with that to me is that the moon is always about fantasy, or so the moon fantasizes, let's say with that. And then the sun shines light. All right, so now those are the neutral baselines: strength, fantasize, shines light. So those are my baseline things. Now the question is, why does my relationship with my boss suck? So the question is the question is asking for information about a problem. So contextually, out of the gate, I know there's going to be some sort of more negative or shadow aspect to these cards anyway, because the question itself is asking what the problem is. Now I have two traditionally pretty positive cards and one sort of negative neutral card, by the stereotype of what I've developed over the years. But I recognize that all of these are neutral. They're probably going to bend more towards the shadow aspect because the question is asking us to shed light on something, on a problem. And interestingly, that's what the sun does. So now what I have to do is I have to work with these three images, these three archetypes, and the question, and come up with an answer. So why does your relationship with your boss suck? I'm going to start with the sun here, just because the sun sheds light on. So this is telling me the boss sees something. And the boss, I think, sees through whatever deceptions or fantasies that this person is trying to play. And she has a powerful dislike for deception. So the boss can see through your shit, is essentially what. The boss knows that you're trying to tell her something. She can see through your deception, and the power of that is really damaged the relationship. Like the strength of that act, of your lies, whatever, you know what I mean? So now that I've gone into interpretation of the cards, the moon has really become negative, which is a pretty traditional interpretation for me. But if the question were different, that wouldn't be the case. So if the question were, how do I improve relationships with my boss? In this case, I'm looking for positive aspects, right? Because the question is asking for light, not shadow. And so in all of these cases, I return to neutral. We have strength or power, we've got fantasize, and we've got shedding light on. And so in this case, I would say that there's some strength, there's some power in the big thinking and the ideas that you have, in the creative ability of your mind and your ability to sort of work with fantasy, to brainstorm and show your boss, shed light on your boss, your good ideas. So fantasize in this case becomes your ability to brainstorm and to imagine what's not there that you can show your boss. So you have a really strong ability to brainstorm and be creative, to imagine what other people haven't, to see what's not there, and you can show that to your boss, and that will improve your relationship. So in that case, this becomes a much more positive thing. But I always start from, I'm going to say I always start from neutral. That's not true. But what I should do is start from neutral, because it allows me to work with the cards without making value judgment. Now, none of these necessarily were cards that... I think imagistically, is that a word? Image-wise, these are all pretty neutral images. But if the devil comes up in the context, right, the devil is neutral too. Even though we believe, in our historical Christianized world, the devil is negative. The devil is as neutral as anything else. What does the devil do? And there's an interesting one. Now, for me, the devil represents extreme. and also sort of gosh, see, this is not easy. So even though I'm like talking through it, doesn't mean I'm good at it all the time, and I really could benefit from going through and doing this work more closely myself. But the devil, what's the devil's action? And all the words that are coming to mind are immediately negative or have a negative connotation. But the devil, let's just for the purposes of this reading say the devil seduces. Which is a big aspect of this card to me anyway. So the devil seduces. So if this question is how do I improve my relationship with my boss, obviously seducing your boss isn't a good thing, right? And certainly not putting a hex on them. But seduce as a neutral, powerful seduce and shed light on. So what is seduce? So you have to charm. You have to shine a light on your ability to be seductive, your powerful ability to seduce, to be charming in this case, to think about the devil as a charmer. You just need to be more charming with your boss, be more gregarious, be more, you know what I mean? And I'm doing this really quickly, and you can see that it isn't easy. It does involve sitting down and really coming up with the baseline neutral for each card. And it can change too. You know what I mean? You're not committing yourself to a forever keyword. And the word matters less than having a sense of the archetype that's free of judgment, or that is as free of judgment as you can get. So I may have made it seem that it's about the keyword that I choose. It's not. Again, a keyword is another value judgment, you know what I mean, of the archetype. It's a description. We're just trying to come up with words that are judgment-free, that we associate with the archetype, so that we are released from our preconceptions about whether the card is good or bad. You know? So the words that you wind up with, the concepts that you wind up with, are themselves value judgments and don't necessarily matter all that much. But what matters more is that your ideas about the archetype start at 0 and can go to 10 or negative 10 based on the question and based on the other cards it's working with. And that the image can flavor the conversation. You know, so if I return to the devil in this reading, as I just said, how do you prove your relationship with your boss? You know, depending on like what's your boss? Does your boss have an occult bent, or does your boss have a wicked sense of humor? You know what I mean? Like if you have like a wicked sense of humor together, that may be something. You know, whatever. Like the image can, you know, can guide you. And it can flavor the conversation. It's seasoning, though. It's not the protein. The cards are chicken, like neutral. They don't have a whole lot of flavor. What you put on them adds flavor, and that flavor includes the image. That seasoning includes the image and the question and the other cards. So that's where I'm getting. So ultimately, this long 40-minute ramble. Gosh, surprising, right? Is about starting from 0 with the cards, coming up, especially with the trumps, with a neutral moment, understanding, not necessarily even having words, but understanding the archetype as a neutral thing, free of judgment, so that when it comes up in different contexts, you can have an elastic experience, so that the devil, when it comes up in a question about a relationship, you know, how do I spice up my relationship? The devil tells you to get kinky, not to become an addict or throw yourself into the relationship to an unhealthy degree. That the devil is like, why don't you mix things up in the bed? You know what I mean? So that's where I'm going with this. So I hope this makes sense. Let me know if you have any questions, and I'll see you next time.